The magic, the wonder, the mystery, and the innocence of a child's heart are the seeds of creativity that will heal the world. I really believe that.
You're confident.
Michael Jackson is back in the spotlight. With the release of the Jackson film, the world is once again revisiting the life of one of the most famous and most controversial figures in modern history. A life that has been told, retold, debated, scrutinized and distorted for decades. But the problem is that most people don't actually know the full story. We don't know the details of his life beyond what the movie tells us. Yes, we know the music, we know the headlines, we know the image, but we don't really know the person behind all of this.
Well, on stage for me was home. I was most comfortable, and still most comfortable, on stage. But once I got off stage, I was very sad.
Because Michael's life was never just about fame. It wasn't just about success, or controversy, or even the accusations that would later define his public image. It was something much deeper. It was the story of someone who, from the very beginning, stopped belonging to himself.
It's a hard situation, and it's something I have to put up with.
An artist consumed by expectation. A man who was constantly being observed, judged, and misunderstood on a global scale. So in this video, we're not just going to revisit the highlights, we're going to break down the full story, from his childhood in Gary, Indiana, to the rise of a global phenomenon, to the transformation of his identity, to the isolation, the accusations, and the final years that would ultimately define his legacy. His life had already been decided for him, and once you see that clearly, you start to feel sorry for him, and everything else starts to make a lot more sense. Michael Jackson was not born a legend, he was not born the king of pop, and he was not born into a life that resembled anything close to the myth that would later surround him. Before the stadiums, before the fame, before the spectacle, there was a child. A child who never truly experienced what it meant to be one.
He lost the ability to be a kid before his 12th birthday. Michael Jackson really was never able to go anywhere without a bodyguard, without a limousine, without, people to protect him from his success.
Before the world debated what Michael Jackson was, before all the accusations, the headlines, the physical transformations, something far more decisive had already taken place. His childhood had been taken from him. Not gradually and not by chance, but from the very beginning. Long before he became a global icon, he had already ceased to belong to himself. To understand Michael, we have to go back to Gary, Indiana. Not the glittering stages of Los Angeles or the flashing lights of New York, but a working-class town defined by hardship. Gary was not a place where dreams were nurtured easily. It was industrial, rigid, and often unforgiving. And life there revolved only around survival.
Yeah, we weren't wealthy, but we weren't poor. My father always prepared for the family, as well as my mother.
Michael was born into a large working-class family. 9 children, 2 parents, all living under one roof. Space was limited, privacy was almost non-existent. Rooms were shared, noise was constant, and individuality was secondary to the needs of the household. It was an environment where structure and discipline was not optional, but they were very necessary. At the center of this household stood Joseph Jackson, a man driven by a singular obsession: to pull his family out of poverty. To him, music was not simply art or expression, it was a means of survival.
We've also heard the other side of this fairy tale. The brothers claim that their father drove them brutally, beat them. This is the man Michael said made him nauseous with fear.
Michael entered that system at the age of 5, an age where most children are still discovering play, imagination, and the boundaries of their own identity. Michael was introduced to a world of rehearsals, expectations, and performance. He was not asked if he wanted to participate. There was no choice. From the moment his talent became evident, it became our responsibility.
Well, you don't get to do things that other children get to do. The simple things that they so much take for granted. Having friends and slumber parties and buddies and just hanging out. There was none of that for me. I didn't have any friends when I was little. My brothers were my friends.
Rehearsals were strict. Discipline was constant. Mistakes were not treated as part of learning, but as failures to meet expectation. The standard was perfection. and the cost of falling short was fear. What should have been a space for creativity and growth became instead a structure defined by pressure and control.
Going to the recording studio, there was a park across the street, and I'd see all the children playing, and they'd be rooting and making noise, and I would cry. It'd make me sad that I would have to go and work instead.
This was not simply a demanding childhood, it was a system where approval had to be earned, where affection was conditional, and where identity was shaped not through exploration, but through performance. Michael was not growing into himself, he was being molded into something else. And then, something even more complex began to emerge. Michael's talent did not remain confined to small stages or controlled environments. The Jackson 5 began performing in adult venues, clubs, bars, and spaces that exposed him to dynamics far beyond his years. These were environments filled with noise, alcohol, and adult behavior, places where innocence did not belong.
I mean, when people wonder why I always have children around, because I find the thing that I never had through them.
At an age where his understanding of the world was still forming, Michael was witnessing realities he could not fully process. He was performing for audiences who saw him not as a child, but as entertainment. The boundaries between childhood and adulthood blurred, not through gradual experience, but through forced exposure.
Disneyland, amusement parks, arcade games. I adore all that stuff because when I was little, it was always work, 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 from one concert to the next.
This early collision with the adult world carried consequences that would echo throughout his life. Firstly, it disrupted the natural development of his identity, and it also altered his relationship with himself. But perhaps most importantly, it created a disconnect between who he was and who he was expected to be.
If it wasn't concert, it was the recording studio. If it wasn't that, it was TV shows or interviews or picture sessions.
Because Michael Jackson did not lose his childhood later in life, he did not lose it at the height of fame or during the years of public scrutiny. No, he lost it at the very beginning, before the world knew his name, before the myth was constructed, before the narrative was written. The foundation has already been set. He was not raised to become a person who would later experience fame. He was raised to become the product of it, and once that process began, there was no clear way back. This is where the story fully begins, not with success, but with sacrifice, not with glory, but with loss. Because before Michael Jackson became one of the most famous individuals in human history, he had already paid the price for it, and it was the price that he never fully recovered from. Michael Jackson didn't just succeed. He didn't simply rise through talent, discipline, and opportunity. What happened to Michael was something far more complex and far more unsettling. He was absorbed into a machine built by family, reinforced by industry, and accelerated by global demand. A machine that did not wait for him to grow up, to understand himself, or to choose who he wanted to become. This machine simply took what he was and turned it into something the world could consume.
From the music to the muscle, the magic. It was a triumph, but he still sees only what he missed.
And the Jackson 5 were not a gradual success story either. They were a phenomenon, almost overnight. They became one of the most recognizable acts in America. Their music dominated the charts. Their performances electrified audiences. Their image was everywhere: television, radio, magazines. And at the center of it all was a child, Michael Jackson. A child whose voice, energy, and presence seemed almost impossible for his age. To the world, it was extraordinary. It was inspiring. It was the story of a talent meeting opportunity and changing a family's destiny. But behind that narrative, something else was happening. Because success at that scale does not come without cost. And in Michael's case, the cost was not paid later. It was paid in real time. The workload was relentless. Recording sessions, live performances, television appearances, interviews, rehearsals, tours. There was no real pause, no space to step back, no moment where he could simply exist outside of all that was expected of him. His life became a sequence of obligations, each one tied to performance, each one reinforcing the idea that his value came from what he could deliver. By the time most teenagers are beginning to understand themselves, Michael had already lived multiple careers.
When you started to go through adolescence, having been, this child superstar,
Yes.
was that a particularly difficult time for you?
Very, very, very difficult, really. Yes.
Yes.
By 14, he had released a staggering number of albums. By 24, he had achieved what many artists could not accomplish in a lifetime.
What's your relationship like with him?
I love my father, but I don't know him.
This created a fundamental association in Michael's mind, that love was conditional, and that his worth as a person depended on his ability to meet expectations. It is a structure that does not simply appear with success. It becomes internalized. It shapes how a person sees themselves, how they relate to others, and how they understand their place in the world.
Michael is quiet now. When he was younger, he wasn't that quiet. But I don't know, I think the stage might have done that to him.
Alongside this environment came another layer of control: religion. Michael was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, a Christian denomination known for its strict interpretation of the Bible and its emphasis on moral discipline, obedience, and separation from what it considers worldly influences. Jehovah's Witnesses follow a highly structured way of life. They do not celebrate birthdays or most holidays, including Christmas, as they view them as having non-biblical or pagan origins. They are also discouraged from engaging in many forms of popular culture and are expected to maintain a clear distinction between themselves and the broader society. Behavior, identity, and expression are closely monitored, not just by the community, but internally, through a strong sense of spiritual accountability. Activities that might seem normal in a child's development, self-expression, exploration, even certain friendships, can be framed as distractions or deviations from a higher purpose. For a child growing up in this environment, the world becomes something to navigate carefully rather than freely. For Michael, this added another layer of structure to an already controlled life. Beyond the demands of his father and the pressures of performance, there was now a spiritual framework reinforcing discipline, restraint, and conformity. His time was not only occupied by rehearsals and tours, but also by religious activities, including door-to-door preaching, something he reportedly participated in even during the early stages of his fame. This created a profound contrast in his reality, a global performer admired by millions, yet simultaneously living within a belief system that encouraged humility, modesty, and withdrawal from that very same world that celebrated him. The impact of this duality is difficult to overstate. On one side, he was being pushed into the spotlight, into a life of visibility, expression, and performance. On the other, he was being guided towards introspection, restraint, and separation. These two forces did not simply coexist, they collided. And in that collision, that space for a coherent sense of self became increasingly limited. Between family expectations and religious structure, there was very little room left for personal freedom. Identity was not something to be discovered organically, but something shaped externally, by authority, by belief, by obligation. And for Michael, this meant that from a very early age, the process of becoming himself was constantly interrupted, redirected, or suppressed.
The idea is to take it a step forward and to innovate, or else why am I doing it? I don't want to be just another can in the assembly line.
And so, while the world was watching a prodigy, someone's identity was built externally, defined by expectations, shaped by pressure, and constantly validated or invalidated by others.
I want to, create, do something that's totally different and unusual.
What looked like success from the outside was, in many ways, the beginning of confinement. The more he achieved, the less space he had to be anything else. The more he was celebrated, the more he was defined by that image. There was no separation between the person and the performer, no boundary between who he was and what he represented. Because the story is no longer simply about talent and achievement. It becomes a story about what happens when a human being is shaped entirely by systems that do not prioritize their humanity. Michael Jackson was not just becoming famous, he was becoming something fixed, something expected, something required. And once that process was complete, there was no clear way for him to step outside of it. His life was not about the peak of success, it was about the cost of reaching it too early. By the time Michael Jackson reached the peak of global fame, something fundamental had already begun to shift. The exploitation he experienced as a child did not disappear, it evolved. It adapted to a new scale, because once he became an idol, the world didn't just consume his music, the world began to consume him. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. And you could see this through his body, his face, his voice, his identity. Every visible aspect of who he was became subject to constant observation, interpretation, scrutiny, and judgment. The same world that had once celebrated him with admiration now examined him with a different kind of attention, a colder one, a more invasive one, and often a cruel one. Michael Jackson did not simply grow older in the public eye, he transformed under it, and every stage of that transformation was documented, dissected, and in many cases, ridiculed.
How much plastic surgery have you had?
Very, very little. You can count them on 2 fingers.
And it is difficult to fully grasp the scale of scrutiny he faced. There have been many famous individuals, many public figures whose lives have been exposed and debated, but few, if any, have been subjected to the same level of sustained global fascination with their physical appearances. Michael Jackson became, in many ways, one of the most publicly scrutinized individuals in modern history, and not with empathy, but with complete, absolute spectacle.
More than we are
I've
even
never had my cheekbones done, never had my eyes done, never had my lips done and all this stuff. They just go too far. I mean, it's crazy.
The media fixated on his face, on the changes in his skin, on the evolution of his features, on the contrast between who he had been and who he was becoming. Each shift, each alteration, each visible difference became material, not for understanding, but for commentary. And that commentary quickly turned into mockery. Late night shows, tabloids, headlines, casual conversations. His appearance became a recurring subject of humor, of speculation, of exaggeration. His image was no longer treated as a part of a person, but as something separate, something abstract, something that could be reshaped, simplified, and turned into a caricature.
Let's just put it this way. If all the people in Hollywood who have had plastic surgery, if they went on vacation, there wouldn't be a person left in town.
What makes this particularly disturbing is not simply that Michael changed, it is how he was forced to change under observation. Because change in itself is not unusual. Human beings evolve, they age, they respond to their circumstances. But Michael Jackson's transformation did not occur in privacy, it unfolded in front of an audience that never looked away.
When people make up stories that I don't want to be who I am, it hurts me. It's a problem for me, okay? I can't control it, okay?
One of the most misunderstood aspects of this period was his skin condition, called vitiligo, a medical condition that causes loss of pigmentation, creating visible contrast in the skin. And instead of being understood as a health issue, it became another source of suspicion, another element of the narrative constructed around him. The reality of the condition was often overshadowed by speculation, distortion, and disbelief, often calling him a racist for wanting to change his skin, even accusing him of using bleach to do so. And so, what could have been approached with clarity became something else entirely, a story, or a controversy, or even a joke. This is where the transformation becomes more than physical, because when a person is constantly observed in this way, when their body becomes the center of attention, of scrutiny, of ridicule, it begins to alter how they relate to themselves. The body stops being a private space, it becomes a public object. And Michael did not just live inside his body, he had to live with how the world perceived it, and that perception was rarely neutral. It was loaded with expectation, with projection, and with a lot and lots of judgment.
No, I try not to look in the mirror. I really do, because I'm never happy with what I see, so I go on with my work and get it done.
He was expected to remain recognizable, yet constantly reinvent himself, to be familiar, yet always new, to preserve the image that made him iconic, while simultaneously evolving beyond it. There's a contradiction that very few people could navigate, and one that becomes even more unstable when combined with a history of trauma, pressure, and identity disruption. Because Michael's relationship with his own image was never simple. From a young age, he had been taught to perform, to present, to meet expectations. His appearance was not just personal, it was part of his role, part of what he represented. And as that role expanded, so did the pressure to control how he was seen. But control, in this context, was never fully possible, because the narrative was no longer his. It belonged to the public, to the tabloids, to the endless cycle of attention that demanded something new, something different, something more. And so, over time, something subtle but profound took place. Michael's body ceased to be his own. It became a surface onto which the world projected its fascination, its discomfort, its expectations, and its judgments. He was no longer simply changing, he was being watched, judged, scrutinized, and reduced while he was changing. And in that was of what he had been turned into. And this is the point in his life where the story transitions, where the broken child becomes the broken adult, where the question is no longer just what was done to him, but what those forces created over time. A person whose identity had been shaped externally for so long that even his own reflection no longer belonged entirely to him. By the time Michael Jackson reached the height of his fame, he had achieved something that very few individuals in history ever experienced. He had become universally recognizable, not just admired, not just successful, but omnipresent. His image, his voice, his identity existed everywhere at once, and yet, beneath that global presence, something else was taking shape, an absence, because for all the attention he received, for all the noise that surrounded him, Michael Jackson was profoundly alone. Fame, at that scale, does not simply elevate a person, it isolates them. It creates distance between the individual and the world, between intention and perception, between trust and suspicion, and relationships begin to shift, interactions become transactional, and every conversation carries the question of motive, and constantly evaluated. It was, in many ways, an idea rooted in a very specific longing, the longing to return to a moment that had never fully existed. The reference to Peter Pan is not accidental. The idea of refusing to grow up, of remaining in a state untouched by the constraints of adulthood, resonates deeply with Michael's life, but in his case it was not simply a romantic notion, it was a response to a reality in which growing up had not meant gaining freedom, but losing something essential. Because for Michael Jackson, adulthood did not represent independence, it represented continuation of pressure, of the scrutiny, of a life where he was never fully in control of his own existence. Neverland, therefore, became the attempt to interrupt that continuity, to build something separate, something protected.
Well, is this a part of you, what we were talking about earlier? The pain of growing up and not being able to experience all the things that kids normally experience, and so now you are fulfilling all of those fantasies.
You compensate, yes.
Really?
Yes, it's very true.
Within that space, Michael surrounded himself with elements that reflected this intention, such as attractions, open landscapes, and environments designed specifically not for efficiency or status, but for experience, for play, for a kind of emotional simplicity that stood in stark contrast to the complexity of his public life. But perhaps the most significant and most controversial aspect of this environment was his closeness and proximity to being with children.
To be like children, to love children, to be as pure as children are. And to make yourselves as innocent and see the world through eyes of wonderment and the whole magical quality of it all. And I love that.
And this is where the narrative becomes more complex, because this proximity cannot be understood in simplistic terms. It cannot be reduced to a single explanation, nor should it be approached without context. From a psychological perspective, it aligns with a pattern that has been present throughout his life, because Michael will be in constant search of spaces that feel less threatening, less transactional, and less conditional. Because in our world, where adult relationships were often defined by expectation, negotiation, and hidden motives, children represented the opposite. They represented something different, a form of interaction that, at least in his perception, felt more genuine. Because what we're observing here is not simply his behavior, it is an attempt, however imperfect and however controversial, to find a form of connection that does not mirror the dynamics that shaped his life early on.
No, because it's all moral and it's all pure. I don't even think that way. It's not what's in my heart.
So you'll do it again?
Ever. Do what again?
I mean, you'll have a child sleeping over.
Of course. They want.
Yes.
It's on the level of purity and love and just innocence, complete innocence. If you're talking about sex, and that's a nut. That's not me. Go to the guy down the street, because it's not Michael Jackson. It's not what I'm interested in.
And the interviews I watched with him emphasize this repeatedly. It points to the idea that Michael actively sought out environments that felt emotionally safe, predictable, and above all, normal. Not normal in the sense of simplicity, but normal in the sense of being free from expectation, free from negotiation, and free from the constant awareness that everyone around him might want something. He was drawn to the structure of these environments, the presence of parents, siblings, routines, elements that reflected a version of childhood he had not experienced before, in a stable or consistent way. In these settings, he was not required to deliver anything. There were no rehearsals, no expectations of perfection, no exchange of anything, just his presence. This contrasted directly with his experience in the adult world, where relationships were often transactional. Many interactions were shaped by what he represented rather than who he was. And this created a deep sense of mistrust, that over time, it became increasingly difficult for him to distinguish genuine connection from opportunism. Within that context, his gravitation toward what appeared to be normal families begins to take on a different meaning. It was not simply preference, it was not randomness, it was, under this interpretation, a search for a form of interaction that felt grounded, stable, and emotionally accessible. A space where he could exist without the weight of his identity. Moments where he was not treated as Michael Jackson, the global pop figure, but simply as Michael. And this behavior, building Neverland and all those eccentric things, They were all a response to a life that had never allowed him to develop within the boundaries of a normal experience. Neverland was a refuge, built by someone who did not know how to exist outside a constructed reality, and in that sense, it tells us less about who he was trying to be and more about what he had never been allowed to become. There is a point in Michael's life where the nature of public attention surrounding him changes in a fundamental way. Up to that moment, the focus had largely been on his work, his influence, and increasingly his personal eccentricities. But from the early 1990s onward, that focus began to shift toward a far more serious and complex set of issues. The narrative surrounding him became increasingly defined not by artistic output, but by legal allegations, accusations, media interpretation, and the evolving relationship between public perception and formal judicial processes. In 1993, Michael faced the first major set of allegations, brought forward by the Chandler family. The case quickly developed along two parallel tracks that are characteristic of the United States legal system. First, a civil case, focused on financial damages, and secondly, a potential criminal investigation, which could require higher burden of proof and could result in prosecution. This dual structure is essential to understanding the decisions that followed later.
I talked to my lawyers and I said, can you guarantee me that justice will prevail? And they said, Michael, we cannot guarantee you that a judge or a jury will do anything. And with that, I was like catatonic. I was outraged.
How much money was it?
Totally outraged.
The civil case was resolved through a financial settlement in early 1994. It is important to note that within the US legal framework, such settlements do not constitute an admission of guilt. They are often used to avoid prolonged litigation, reduce legal exposure, and limit the reputational and financial risks associated with extended proceedings. And this is exactly why Michael did it, because his decision to settle should be viewed within the broader context of unprecedented media attention, commercial pressures, and the vulnerability of his public image at the time.
I have got to do something to get out from under this nightmare. All these lies and all these people coming forward to get paid in these tabloid shows, just lies, 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 lies.
The criminal investigation, which was conducted separately, did not result in charges being filed, because the Chandler family, the accusators, declined to continue cooperating with the criminal process. From a legal standpoint, this limited the ability of prosecutors to move forward. However, in the public sphere, this nuance was largely overshadowed by the visibility of the civil settlement. As a result, a simplified interpretation gained traction, that the settlement itself implied culpability. This interpretation, while not legally granted, proved to be highly durable in shaping public opinion.
So what I did, we got together again with my advisors, and they advised me, it was hands down, a unanimous decision, resolve the case. This could be something that could go on for 7 years.
1 month later, January 25, 1994, Michael reached a financial settlement in the civil case brought by the Chandler family, with widely reported figures in the range of $15 to $20 million. Within the structure of the US legal system, this resolved the civil proceedings without constituting an admission of guilt. Following the settlement, the accuser declined to participate further in the parallel criminal investigation.
Don't treat me like a criminal, because I am innocent. I have been forced to submit to a dehumanizing and humiliating examination by the Santa Barbara County Sheriff Department and the Los Angeles Police Department earlier this week. They served a search warrant on me which allowed them to view and photograph my body, including my penis, my buttocks, my lower torso, thighs, and any other area that they wanted.
As a result, after more than a year of intense media coverage, prosecutors announced that they would not proceed with charges, citing the absence of sufficient testimony to continue the case in court.
Must decline prosecution involving Mr. Jackson.
A decade later, in 2003, a second wave of scrutiny emerged, following the broadcast of the documentary Living with Michael Jackson, directed by Martin Bashir. The program presented itself as an intimate portrayal of Jackson's personal life, but it also included moments and statements that were widely interpreted as controversial. The documentary played a significant role in reinforcing existing doubts and reshaping public gossip. It did so not necessarily through factual inaccuracies, but through selective framing, emphasis, and editorial choices that amplified ambiguity and concern.
But the truth is that he was never convicted of any crime. I never saw any wrongdoing myself. And whilst his lifestyle may have been a bit unorthodox, I don't believe it was criminal.
Shortly after the documentary aired, new allegations were brought forward, leading to a criminal case in Santa Barbara County. This time, the process culminated in a full trial in 2005, during which Michael Jackson faced multiple charges, including counts related to child molestation, conspiracy, and the administration of alcohol to a minor. The trial was highly publicized and involved extensive testimony, cross-examination, and the presentation of both prosecution and defense arguments over several months. In June 2005, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts. Legally, this represented a clear outcome. However, the conclusion of the trial did not resolve the broader issue of public perception. By that point, the accumulation of allegations, media coverage, and prior narratives had already established a framework through which Michael was viewed. Michael addressed the charges within the confines of the courtroom, but he did not fully dismantle the associations that had developed over time. This distinction between legal resolution and public interpretation is central to understanding this phase of his life. Judicial processes are structured around evidence, procedure, and defined standards of proof. Media environments, by contrast, operate through repetition, visibility, and narrative coherence. These two systems intersect, but they do not function in the same way. As a result, outcomes in one domain do not necessarily determine perceptions in the other. And by the early 2000s, a form of narrative consolidation had taken place. Michael's identity in the public sphere had become increasingly tied to a set of recurring themes: controversy, ambiguity, and deviation from social norms. These themes were reinforced across different forms of media, and over time, became more influential than individual legal developments. This does not mean that the legal cases were insignificant. On the contrary, they were central events with serious implications. However, their meaning was shaped not only by their outcomes, but by how they were presented, interpreted, and integrated into a broader narrative. In that sense, what Michael faced was not limited to specific accusations, but extended to a sustained process of public evaluation that did not end with formal resolutions.
Please keep an open mind and let me have my day in court.
By this stage, the trajectory of his life had entered a new phase. The earlier story of artistic achievement and personal struggle had become intertwined with a more complex and in many ways more difficult reality, one in which reputation, identity, and perception were no longer fully within his control. The result was not a single moment of transformation, but a gradual shift in how he was understood. And once that shift had taken place, it proved extremely difficult to reverse. By the time Michael reached the final stage of his life, the trajectory of his story no longer resembled a conventional rise or fall.
It was he, in his own words, described as a humiliating experience. They did a strip search on him, took photographs of him. They had like 70 police officers go through his property. And what made him angry about it is that they never found anything that would indicate that he was, in fact, guilty.
Oh, it took a lot out of him, that. I mean, he didn't eat very well. Can you imagine the pressure he must have been under?
It is more accurately understood as a gradual process of erosion, not sudden or defined by a single turning point. Scrutiny, persistent expectations, limited privacy, and a level of exposure that left little room for recovery or stability. What remained was not simply a global figure navigating difficulty, but an individual carrying the weight of a life that had rarely allowed him to exist outside of those conditions.
When you have broken all those records, when you have the #1 album ever sold, the #2 album ever sold, when you've broken every record there is to break, when you have become an icon in the industry, is there always the pressure to do something bigger and something better?
It makes it harder each time to follow up. So you try to be as original as you can be without thinking about statistics. Just go from the soul and from the heart.
At this stage, Michael's identity had become inseparable from the public construct that surrounded him. He was no longer perceived primarily as an artist or even as a controversial figure responding to events, but rather as a symbol, one that had been continuously interpreted, redefined, and in many ways exhausted. The role of Michael Jackson had become something that required constant maintenance. It involved an ongoing negotiation between past achievements, present expectations, and the persistent demand for relevance. Rather than diminishing over time, these pressures intensified, particularly as his personal situation became more fragile and his public image more complex. The constant psychological strain of living under such conditions is difficult to isolate or quantify. It does not emerge from a single event, but from the sustained absence of normal boundaries, the lack of rest, privacy, and the ability to disengage. Over time, this strain can manifest physically, and in Michael's case, it appears to have required forms of relief that developed into patterns of dependency. This dependency is not presented as an isolated issue, but as part of a broader environment in which discomfort, whether emotional, psychological, or physical, was managed in ways that allowed ongoing commitments and expectations to be met.
He wasn't aware of what was happening. He was dulling his pain. But it really frightened me because I have been there. And I know how easy it is to get there when you're in mental or physical pain.
This environment, importantly, did not operate in isolation from his public image. Projects, performances, and contractual obligations continued to be tied to his presence and capacity to function. Within such a context, the distinction between care and continuation can become less clear. Support structures may coexist with expectations that, intentionally or not, sustain the very conditions contributing to instability. The result is not necessarily the product of deliberate intent, but of a system that continues to operate even as the individual at its center becomes increasingly vulnerable. From this perspective, the final outcome of his life does not appear as an abrupt or unpredictable event, but as the culmination of a long-term process. The factors that shaped his earlier experiences, control, performance, exposure, and external definition remained present, evolving in form but not in essence. Over time, isolation deepened, trust became more difficult to establish, and the distance between the individual and the public construct continues to widen. Within that distance, the capacity for stability diminished. At the center of this narrative, however, there remains a consistent element: the presence of a person whose development had been shaped from an early age by forces largely outside of his control, a person whose identity had been constructed in relation to expectation, rather than autonomy, and whose life had unfolded within systems that prioritized performance, output, and visibility. By the end of his life, Michael existed within a framework that offered limited protection against the ongoing effects of those conditions.
I love what I do, and I would love people to love what I do and to be loved. I just simply want to be loved wherever I go, all over the world, because I love people of all races from my heart with true affection.
Michael's death can therefore be understood not only as the loss of a widely recognized cultural figure, but as the conclusion of a trajectory defined by long-term exposure, sustained pressure, and constrained personal agency.
And I think that he always wanted to see the best in people. And I think, towards the end, he realized that there are some very bad people out there who don't wish you well at all.
It marks the end of a life in which the distinction between the individual and the role he inhabited was rarely clear. In reflecting on this trajectory, a broader pattern becomes visible. From an early age, his value was closely tied to what he could contribute, first within a family structure, and later within a global cultural and economic system. As his career progressed, that value expanded, but the underlying dynamic remained consistent. Over time, the individual became increasingly identified with the functions he performed and the expectations he fulfilled. As a child, he was useful. As an adult, he was valuable. And as a public figure, he was continuously interpreted and consumed. And at no stage was there a sustained period in which he existed fully outside of those roles.
Director Kenny Ortega noted that Jackson often didn't show up, and when he did, he was late, weak, and fatigued.
And unfortunately, even though Michael Jackson gave his world for us, we took Michael Jackson out of this world.
Make the world more beautiful by sharing with me the wonderful feeling you get when your soul is lifted up to become pure love.